Welcome to Illuminati Killers Indonesia.
Organisme transgenetika, atau organisme terubah suai secara genetik, yang dalam bahasa Inggris dikenal sebagai Genetically Modified Organism atau GMO, adalah organisme yang bahan genetiknya telah diubah dengan menggunakan teknik dalam bidang genetika, biasanya dikenali sebagai teknologi penyatuan kembali DNA. Dengan rekayasa genetis itu, komponen makhluk hidup telah diubah dan disesuaikan, sehingga menjadi lebih unggul, semisal tahan hama, tahan penyakit, dan lebih banyak menghasilkan panen, atau menambah gemuk hewan ternak. Namun masalahnya, penyilangan DNA ini tak mempedulikan spesies yang berdekatan, misal biasanya untuk menjadikan tanaman jagung unggul, maka disilangkan dengan spesies jagung lainnya. Selama ini teknik penyilangan seperti itu, bukan justru membenarkan dengan menyilangkan DNA di luar dari spesiesnya seperti metode GMO ini. Karena metode itu sangatlah berbahaya untuk yang menggunakan atau yang memakannya. Sebagai contoh metode GMO yang berbahaya adalah penyilangan genetik melalui rekayasa genetis tanaman jagung yang mudah terserang hama, lalu disilangkan dengan jenis bakteri yang dapat melawan hama tersebut, sehingga jadilah tanaman jagung tipe baru yang tahan hama. Contoh dan fakta lainnya adalah jenis buah pisang yang unggul, dihasilkan dari penyilangan DNA sebuah spesies pisang dengan spesies pisang lainnya. Namun yang terjadi pada metode GMO adalah gen DNA dari pisang itu disilangkan dengan DNA di luar spesies pisang lainnya, alias yang jauh sekali dari gen pisang itu sendiri, yaitu dari DNA spesies ikan. Bahkan tak hanya tanaman dan buah-buahan saja, ayam, sapi, ikan dan hasil ternak lainnya, juga disilangkan dengan spesies yang jauh dari spesies yang akan disilangkan itu. Dan gilanya, sampai pakan ternak itu pun disilang dengan metode GMO. Misal, rumput, gabah, palet, dan pakan ternak lainnya. Pakan untuk ternak sapi misalnya, ternyata memakai campuran daging atau tulang dari binatang hasil GMO juga. Campuran daging atau tulang itu dibuat bubuk terlebih dahulu sebelum akhirnya dijadikan pakan ternak. Hewan-hewan herbivora itu dibuat menjadi omnivora, bahkan karnivora, dengan memakan campuran daging, bahan yang bahkan dari spesiesnya sendiri. Hal ini menjadikannya kanibal. Menurut banyak riset, hasil daging ternak ini dapat membahayakan kesehatan dan akan menimbulkan banyak penyakit di masa mendatang.
GMO stands for genetically modified organism. Basically what it is food made in a laboratory. Until the last 20 or 30 years, this is food that has never existed before in humanity. So it's made in a laboratory, and more often than not, they're inserting viruses or bacteria into these plants.
About 10,000 years ago, people found that they didn't have to chase their food around all day. They could grow it right there where they were. It's called farming. And ever since then, we've been trying to control plants and animals for 3 good reasons: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, how many cows do you think you'd see if they'd never been domesticated by humans? You ever seen a cow out in the wild fighting for its life? You think chickens will one day rise up and take over the world? No, I don't think so. Somewhere back in time, thousands and thousands of years ago, feeding ourselves changed from a little luck to a lot of science. We've been trying to improve that science ever since. Haven't we, ladies? In the United States, grocery shelves are filled with genetically modified food. Take a look at this corn. No blemishes, not a kernel out of place. Only in America, right? Well, not exactly. In Europe, if a food is genetically modified, it has to be labeled as such. Now, why is that? Is there something to be afraid of? Well, that's a good question, and one that's probably not asked often enough. We're getting more and more genetically modified food faster and faster. What is it? Do we need it? Is it safe? Well, let's have a look. Every living thing contains DNA, which includes chromosomes and genes. Now, genes provide the instructions to build a living thing. If you change one of the genes, you rewrite one of the instructions. So instead of Bill Nye the brown-eyed guy, you'd get Bill Nye with blue eyes. Some people think that would be a distinct improvement. But when we genetically modify our food, say by taking a gene from a fish and putting it in a tomato, we're creating a whole new species, one that's never existed on Earth before. So some would say, you've created a monster, a frankenfood. Others would say, no, it's still a fruit or a vegetable. I'm just making my lunch. Do you, domesticated wheat, take this wild wheat to be your lawfully wedded hybrid? See, breeding food crops is a lot like a marriage, or a wedding, a shotgun wedding, because the wheat doesn't have much say in the matter. But traditional breeding of food crops takes plenty of human intervention. Agricultural scientists have been tinkering with our food for centuries. That's why most of the food you eat cannot be found in nature. So watermelon, tomatoes, plums, and corn bear little resemblance to their original natural species. But now scientists can take it another step. They can get rid of this wedding ceremony altogether and mix genes from species that are hardly related at all. So how does that go? Something old, something new, something borrowed, and something... There's nothing blue here. This is an organically grown papaya, a tropical fruit. This particular one is infected with the very common ring spot virus. Now, people eat papayas like this all the time. This is a papaya that's been genetically modified so that it has a tiny piece of the DNA from that very same ring spot virus embedded in its DNA. It's immune or resistant to ring spot infection. So which one do you want to eat? The natural one with lots of ring spot virus DNA, or the modified one with just a little bit of that very same DNA? It's the classic dilemma of natural versus modified. Is it good versus evil, or is it just another step in the march of agricultural progress?
Ya, saya mau jelaskan sedikit tentang masalah GMO. Barangkali ini satu topik sendiri nanti suatu hari. Jadi nggak ada hubungannya dengan diet sebetulnya. GMO adalah yang disebut dengan Genetic Modified Organism. Ya, nah GMO ini mempunyai perusahaan. Nah, bayangin, sebetulnya kita menghidupkan sayur dan buah itu karena anugerah alam. Tapi ada orang yang serakah nih, ada orang yang serakah, yang panennya mau sepanjang tahun. Jadi kalau perlu musim durian dari bulan Januari sampai Desember. Dia nggak ikhlas kalau musim durian itu di musim panas. Ada orang pengen makan kedelai karena permintaan kedelai di dunia tinggi. Ya, permintaan jagung tinggi. Jadi dia kalau bisa, kalau yang tadinya panen setahun 2 kali, kalau bisa setahun bisa panen 3 atau 4 kali. Jadi atas keserakahan manusia dan permintaan konsumsi yang tinggi, maka diciptakanlah ras. Nah, istilah ras genetik tertentu dari tanaman-tanaman ini, dan tentu saja ada harga yang harus dibayar. Karena apa? Tanaman-tanaman ini adalah tanaman yang kebal dengan hama. Nah, ini yang menarik, kebal dengan hama. Jadi mereka menggunakan yang disebut dengan glifosat. Nah, glifosat ini adalah bukan sekedar pestisida, tetapi juga anti hama yang sangat ampuh. Jadi tanamannya ini tegap perkasa, menantang musim dan menantang cuaca, ya istilahnya begitu. Nah, problem dengan penggunaan glifosat itu yang menjadi masalah. Karena glifosat ternyata pada penelitian pada mencit, pada binatang, kita baru sampai uji klinis di hewan, karena tidak elok kalau uji klinisnya di manusia. Pada uji klinis pada hewan, lalu ternyata ini akan mengganggu istilah kita disrupsi hormon. Nah, setelah hormonnya terganggu, lalu pada keturunan yang kesekian, ketiga atau keturunan yang keempat, itu justru menyebabkan kemandulan.
Oh, itu tidak langsung di keturunan di selanjutnya, Dok, ya? Tapi di tahap...
Oh iya, karena ini kan perlu ada akumulasi. Perlu ada akumulasi. Jadi zat itu perlu ada akumulasi untuk bisa memberikan efek bagi manusia. Nah, pertanyaannya adalah, itu sebabnya kenapa di negara-negara maju ya untuk bisa mempunyai sumber pangan yang baik, maka atau kejujuran dari pertanian, maka pihak pemerintah itu memberikan stiker-stiker tertentu. Jadi sebabnya kenapa produk-produk yang masih dihasilkan dengan cara konvensional itu kita sebut dengan produk non-GMO. Kadang-kadang produk non-GMO memang akhirnya bisa lebih mahal karena apa? Karena tergantung musim. Dan biasanya juga tidak mungkin jumlahnya sebanyak permintaan karena ya alam itu memang ada limitasinya, nggak bisa di-push, nggak bisa digaspol. Nah, GMO ini menjadi naik daun karena ngeyelnya manusia. Ya, yang saya takutkan adalah satu, misalnya nih, kalau Anda maksa, Anda makan kudu ada nasi. Suatu hari beras bisa menjadi GMO loh. Ya, nah itu dia, itu yang kita takutkan. Apalagi hamanya banyak di Indonesia. Jadi kalau beras sudah diproduksi dengan cara GMO, maka Anda punya masalah nanti.
Kalau rekayasa genetik nggak bagus, bahaya. Jadi kalau Bapak Ibu ketemu buah yang seedless itu nggak pakai biji, jangan makan. Paham maksudnya? Kalau ketemu buah yang tidak ada bijinya, jangan makan. Kalau buah itu dulunya ada biji. Ya seperti anggur. Sekarang ada tuh ada anggur tanpa biji kan, seedless grape gitu kan. Jangan makan. Sekarang pertanyaan gini, dengarkan baik-baik. Semangka, kalau Anda mau nanam semangka, apa yang Anda tanam? Nah sekarang kalau nggak ada biji, nanamnya gimana? Lab. Paham? Bibit dia itu dibikinnya di lab dengan rekayasa genetik gitu loh. Rekayasa genetik Bapak sekalian, mau tidak mau, suka tidak suka, pasti akan berpengaruh ke gennya yang makan. Paham ya? Maka satu kurma yang Anda makan, itu akan berpengaruh ke gen sampai tahunan ke depan. Gitu. Dan katakanlah kita makan sesuatu yang tidak sehat gitu ya, itu ngefeknya sampai tahunan lagi ke depan, gennya rusak semua.
For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by consumer advocate Jeffrey Smith. Smith works to promote healthier non-GMO choices and has done extensive research into how biotech companies mislead legislators and safety officials. He produced the award-winning documentary Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives in 2012, and has written 2 authoritative books about the dangers of GMOs, Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of the genetically engineered foods you're eating, as well as Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods. Jeffrey Smith is the founding executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology, IRT, a leading source of GMO health risk information for consumers, policymakers, and healthcare professionals. Jeffrey Smith, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us from New York City. What first brought GMO foods to your attention?
Well, I actually went to a lecture by a molecular biologist who was very familiar with the techniques of transferring genes between species. And it was in 1996, just before they were about to plant a lot of genetically engineered seeds throughout the Midwest. And he was basically blowing the whistle, saying that the technology was definitely not ready to put into food. that there were surprise side effects, allergens, toxins, new diseases, nutritional problems that could occur. Furthermore, once the genes were released, they would cross-pollinate, seeds would blow, and we would be contaminating the gene pool irreversibly. In other words, putting genes out there that would last in corn or soy for as long as corn or soy existed. And yet he was speaking the words of science and wasn't really communicating with many people outside the room. So with a background in communications and strategy, I realized that he needed a little bit of help. So I decided to pitch in a little bit, and that was 19 years ago.
Wow, and you've been doing this ever since. Why, how does Europe deal with genetically modified organisms, and how different is their way of approaching this from ours, and why?
In 1999, on February 16th, the gag order was lifted on Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading scientist in his field. 7 months earlier, he was fired from his job after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit because he discovered that the process of genetic engineering itself was inherently dangerous. He had fed supposedly harmless genetically engineered potatoes to rats, and within 10 days, the rats developed potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system. He went on television to speak about his concerns, was a hero for 2 days at his prestigious institute, and then 2 phone calls were placed from the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director of the institute. The next day, he was fired from his job. When his gag order was lifted by an order of Parliament, hundreds and hundreds of articles were written on GMOs focusing on safety. Within 10 weeks, the tipping point of consumer rejection was achieved. On April 27th, Unilever publicly committed to stop using GM ingredients in its European brands because the European citizens had heard about it because of their press, but not in the US, where Project Censor described the event as one of the 10 most underreported events of the year. Wow. The day after, Nestle's kicked out GMOs. The next week, everyone kicked out GMOs in Europe. So they were educated about the dangers, the tipping point was achieved, GMOs were kicked out except in animal feed, and it was the consumers that cleared the deck, not the politicians. So in Europe, it's hard to find any GMOs there, whereas in the United States, we've been eating the food in companies' products that have taken GMOs out there, but continue to feed us here because we're not raising a fuss.
Right, and it's and how extensive is the existence of genetically modified organisms in our food supply? What percentage of what we're eating is actually genetically modified?
There's only 8 genetically modified food crops, but because soy and corn are among them, and sugar from sugar beets and cottonseed oil and canola oil, it's in maybe 9 out of 10 processed foods because there may be some high fructose corn syrup or soy lecithin or soy flour or soy oil. However, actually, if you go to the produce section, there's hardly any GMOs. In the produce section, you might find zucchini, yellow squash, papaya from Hawaii or China, or corn. Those are the only products in the produce section that would be genetically engineered out of the 9 products.
Wow. So cook at home. It's like
That's right.
Amazing. It seems from the surveys that I've seen over the years, and certainly from the calls that I get to my radio talk show, is that the majority of Americans are, at the very least, want genetically modified products to be labeled, and perhaps even a majority of Americans would rather that they weren't in our food supply at all. How is it that we're not having this conversation, that our legislatures are not addressing these issues, that our regulators are not talking about the kind of research like you talked about coming out of the UK? Why are we the only country in the world, or the principal country in the world, that has turned its entire human population into guinea pigs?
In 1991, the first Bush administration informed the FDA to promote genetically engineered foods, to rush them to market. So the FDA created a new position, the person to be in charge of policy when the FDA policy was created on GMOs, specifically created that position for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's attorney. They brought in Michael Taylor. His policy said, we don't see any difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, no safety studies are needed, no labeling is needed, and then he became Monsanto's vice president. Now he's back at the FDA as the US food czar. 7 years later, Documents were recovered from a lawsuit filed by Steve Drucker, and it turns out that the sentence in the policy, which is the basis for the entire U.S. government policy, that GMOs are no different, was a lie, a complete fiction. The overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was exactly the opposite. They said GMOs are different, they lead to different risks like allergens, toxins, new diseases and nutritional problems, and needed to be tested even on humans. This went completely over the heads of everyone. In fact, as it went sent to the White House, the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Health and Human Services basically said, we want it to appear as if GMOs are even safer and more precise. So as GMOs were evaluated at higher and higher levels of politics, they got safer and safer. Well, it turns out years later, a medical organization, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, reviewed the animal feeding studies in 2009 and said, there's clearly dangers here, gastrointestinal problems, immune problems, accelerated aging, reproductive disorders, organ damage. They said GMOs should be removed immediately. In the meantime, every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. There's now thousands of doctors doing just that. I interview many of the doctors, and I interview thousands of people who remove GMOs from their diet and say that they're getting better from the same diseases and disorders that the animals that were fed GMOs in the laboratory are suffering from. Then I interviewed farmers and veterinarians who've taken cows and pigs off of GMOs, and they're getting better from the same diseases and disorders. Then we look at the characteristics of the diseases and disorders in the United States on the rise in the U.S. population, and they're rising in parallel with the introduction of GMOs and the use of Roundup, which is used on most GMOs, including deaths from stroke and senile dementia and hypertension and obesity, all sorts of cancers, autism, diabetes. And we've now identified ways in which GMOs and the accompanying chemicals sprayed on them might in fact explain this sharp rise, which, if it's true, would mean GMOs are one of the most dangerous things in our food supply or in our environment.
So are you suggesting that, for example, the explosion of autism in the United States over the last 20 years or so since GMOs came along is more attributable to genetically modified organisms than to the possibility of mercury in vaccines or some other environmental, space aliens or what, do you think the GMOs are responsible for that?
I've interviewed a lot of parents of autistic children who took their kids off of GMOs, put them on a full organic diet, and they watched the kids get better. I have a video right now, a film we're creating, of a family where the kid was diagnosed with autism, and they said he'd be unable to speak, he'd be unable to get married, unable to live on his own, unable to have peer relationships. He was switched to organic diet, his autism diagnosis was taken away. Now, I've seen this consistently, but let's look beyond anecdotal evidence. There's an MIT scientist named Dr. Stephanie Seneff who's pulled down the big data off the internet all about autism, and she fully characterized the changes in the body of autistic children and understood why those changes caused the autistic symptoms. But she couldn't figure out what environmental change caused the changes in the body. Until she went to a lecture by Dr. Don Huber, professor emeritus from Purdue University and an expert at Roundup. Roundup contains the active ingredient glyphosate. He was explaining what glyphosate does in the body, how it chelates minerals, how it causes a disbalance of gut bacteria and hormones, how it blocks the certain metabolic pathways that can affect neurotransmitters and detoxification, etc., etc. She said she sat on the edge of her chair for 2 hours because everything he said explained what she was looking for. What was the thing in the environment that had changed that skyrocketed the autistic symptoms? Then later she actually tracked the autistic growth in the United States with the growth in the consumption of glyphosate or Roundup as sprayed on genetically modified corn and soy, and the two lines look identical. Now that's correlation. It can't prove causation. But so many people now and so many doctors, interviewed a pediatrician just 2 weeks ago, and she said autism is curable and it happens often when you change the food. Not always, but often when you change the food. So my personal opinion is, yes, a segment of autistic kids do respond very, very well when they get off of GMOs and the agricultural chemicals.
Wow. I interviewed Stephanie Seneff geez, a month or so ago here on this program. It's pretty shocking. She talked about how one of the things that she was most concerned about was how the glyphosate, the Roundup, was altering the gut bacteria, because it's not supposed to affect animals, but it does affect bacteria the same way it affects plants, or through the same metabolic pathway. If I'm describing that right, and
perfectly. And yes.
Yeah, and in the minute we have until the break, can you describe the mechanism by which that works?
Sure. Everyone's heard of serotonin. It's important for mood and behavior. It regulates blood sugar and tells the body, I'm full, I can stop eating. Everyone's heard of melatonin, which is important for sleep cycles. Dopamine is related to Parkinson's. These neurotransmitters depend on aromatic amino acids produced by the gut bacteria. It's produced by a pathway called the shikimate pathway. Now, Monsanto bragged for years that the reason why Roundup kills plants is because it disables the shikimate pathway, and because humans don't have one, it's completely safe for us. We can drink the stuff. But the bacteria inside our gut uses the shikimate pathway to produce these absolutely essential neurotransmitters, which may be why when people get off of GMO food and Roundup, their mind gets better, they may have improvement in Parkinson's or sleep cycles or obesity or blood sugar regulation. It may be this effect on the neurotransmitters. Monsanto is now being sued as a class action lawsuit in California for just this, for lying about the shikimate relevance to human health.
More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Jeffrey Smith right after the break.